liked his in that system. Okay, we're only a few minutes behind. Welcome and thank you for being here. We have risen from executive session and we are on 2.0 correction and modifications to the agenda.
Thank you, President Clemente. At this time, there are no corrections or modifications to the agenda.
Thank you. Then I will move that the agenda be adopted as presented.
Second.
Call for the vote, please.
Ms. Clemente?
Aye.
Mr. Gonzalez?
Aye.
Mr. Latino?
Aye.
Mr. Mays?
Aye.
Mr. Vaz?
Aye.
Our first item is a report and presentation on bond survey results and a board discussion thereon. So, Mrs. Macaluso, I will turn that over to you, and so we can hear this report.
Thank you, President Clemente. Unfortunately, Chris Keating is unable to, from Keating Research is unable to join us today, but we do have Paul Hanley on the phone. Can you check, Barb, to see if he's still online and can hear us?
Mr. Hanley, are you there?
I am, thank you.
Yay.
And so I'm going to ask Mr. Horner to give us an overview of the survey results.
Good afternoon. So after the directions from you at the last meeting, our architect team, Bob Lawson, and I went back to try to really figure out how do we take those directions, and with the tax sensitivity that was noticed in the last survey, how do we come up with two options that were less tax bite and obviously less dollars to get there. So what we ended up with is one option that was at a project cost of $278,500,000, which makes a par amount of $256,500,000. And when you compare that to our last four high school option, that was a $311,800,000, which had a par amount of $291,680 million.
Would you please explain
Okay.
what you mean by the par amount?
Okay, currently the bond market is willing to pay a premium for bonds because they want a interest rate that is slightly different than what it really is, and so they'll pay you more in funds, which is what we've been estimating all the way along. So you're going to sell $218 million worth of bonds, but you're going to receive $237 million worth of project money to work with. And so when you see in the survey the dollar amounts that we were asking about are the par amount, but we need to be able to correlate that back for our knowledge to what was the projects that we were going to do.
Right.
So the last project's amount for the four high school was $311 million, but it only had a par amount of $291 million. We didn't present it that way in the last survey, but in this survey, we're showing you both amounts because that's what the actual tax on any proposed ballot measure would be, is the par amount.
So the par amount is how much it would cost.
That's what
Our
the
community.
taxpayers will actually see.
Okay.
All of the payments per month and all of that was already figured that way. It's just how you present it
Got it.
to the taxpayer.
Okay.
And that's what the actual bond question would be if you do decide to move forward.
Wait, so the bond question reflects the
Par amount.
par amount? Okay.
Yes,
All right,
that's the
thank you.
actual debt that you make the
Incur.
payment on. Yes.
Okay.
Okay. So in the $278,500,000 option, to get us there from the $311 million, obviously we had to make some changes. One of the changes is we had heard in the last one that the aquatic center didn't score real well in the surveys, so that was removed. That was about $10 million. We then looked at, in this option, the two new high schools. Both of these are a 4 high school option. They would be 1,100 student in this option. In the 311 million, they were 1,200 student capacity. But we also included the one thing that was real important to the stakeholders was the extra gym or auditorium. So it's a 1,100 student with the extra gym or auditorium. We did allocate additional funds for that. Then Bob and team went down through with all of the items and really looked hard at what were code compliant issues that we really needed to do. There were some things that the state has a higher priority, like full abatement of your buildings, but as long as you have a management plan, you don't have to do that. Well, that made a substantial amount of dollar difference, so we're only going to abate the projects that we're actually working with and then continue to monitor and manage within our abatement plan. This option still includes replacement of windows, things, but when you get into some of the schools, they actually figured out, well, we do need to replace, like at Minnequa, there was to replace some interior doors and things that became more code compliant as we looked deeper into this. And so it's got some slight modifications going through it. I know we can, if you want, we can get Bob to come up and try to walk down through. That's kind of just the rates and everything. So Grace, is there one other? Okay, there we go. Maybe that one, if we can blow it up enough.
Ms. Maury, I'm going to ask you and Bob to switch places so that they could share that microphone if Bob needs to weigh in.
I guess we
Thank
only
you.
got one mic today. Is there any way to blow that up? I don't know if anybody can see that. So option A is the original 311 million. Option B that we're talking about is for the two new high schools to be 1,100 student for the 278 million. And then option C, which we'll talk about in a second, would make the high schools 1,000 student plus the extra auxiliary gym or auditorium.
And what would be the par amount on option C?
The par amount would be 218,250,000, and the project's amount would be 237,500,000.
And what was the original?
So
311
218.
million with a par of 291,680. It was 311,800.
So we're going to realize about 20 million more from each of these, roughly, give or take.
Yeah, in round terms, that sounds,
Okay.
So we've tried to figure out how to get to a tax impact, which was obviously driving the conversation. One of them was to get us under 300 million, which was, so we've got a 278 million. And then our goal was to get something close to 200 million. But we really struggled that if we got down to the 200 million, were we really taking care of the critical issues that we had to do and trying to get two new high schools out of it, and we just couldn't get there. And so many of our repairs cost you more than they do to go in and build new. So we ended up at 237,500,000. So Bob, you want to talk more about what's the differences on this? Or?
What we did on these two options is basically taking the highest priorities, which were 1s and 2s, and then even further prioritizing those into what we're truly seeing as critical now. There is an assessment that gave us a lengthy list of needs across the district. Then we pared that down to the needs across these 9 or 10 schools. And then we took that further into what is failing now today type scenario. And so we started readjusting, and on that sheet you'll see what changed from that $311 million option A, into how we came down into option B and option C, the things that we sacrificed. This is what we gave up to get to those figures. There was also some realignment of figures, as Dave mentioned. The asbestos abatement was taken from the entire school down to just the affected project areas. So if we were going to replace pipe insulation, it would only be the pipe insulation. And so we put values on all of that to get this pared down as far as that we could go. And then the option C is obviously much more taken out of it.
And it looks like option C in particular eliminates replacement of exterior windows.
Yes.
Can you talk about that a little?
Okay, the exterior windows, that Pueblo's energy code requires standards in energy compliance. Windows are a big part of that. The other thing that's part of that is that they have to be fire code compliant for egress. As right now, it stands today, those windows are grandfathered, which means that, you know, we get to technically overlook that for now until such time that we can come back and address it. So we're able to take all of that window replacement out in option C, leave them as is, because we are not remodeling the building.
Right.
If we remodel the building, then we would, all those code, ADA, fire code, everything comes into play where we'd have to be fully compliant, including the windows.
Okay, thank you. Do you have information on the cost per 100,000 or whatever on these three options? We did the option A, the 311 million.
Yes, we do.
Great. You're going to share that with us?
I'm going to share that with you.
Perfect.
So one other thing on the option C does not include a central kitchen. That was part of how we pared down the expense. So they would just have kitchens back in each, you know, building, like, I mean, the high schools and everything. So you had to raise the cost of the high school just a little bit because you can't, you know, have a central kitchen. Also, in option C, the least expensive, there is only $2 million for the charters. Not in option B, and in option A, the first one had $4 million for the charters. So we've seriously been, you know, looking at all of the different components. Okay, so any more questions on that right now before I get into the taxes? And then, okay, so when you get into a per $100,000, the 278,500,000, or the larger of the two proposals, would be about $8.17 per 100,000.
Per
100,000
month?
per month.
Thank you.
And then the 237,250 is about $6.62 per month, which puts you, you know, on an annual just under $10 on 150,000, which is our average home in Pueblo, and that kind of was one of our cap targets that we were trying to stay with underneath. So we worked really hard with the team, and Bob did an excellent job of trying to figure out how do we make some trimmings off the sides of this, but still keep the intent of what the stakeholders was looking for and what your directions were to get us down to a tax rate that potentially, you know, might work. So then we've done this second survey, which, okay, go ahead.
Can you explain to us the value of this centralized kitchen? Which is the major difference between B and C?
It's about $4 million difference on that. You want to take that on?
Part of that centralized kitchen is continuity in the food and the quality and everything that they do there. It's a centralized team preparing the food. On site, you would have just basically prep kitchens, smaller number of staff, fewer pieces of equipment, more like warming devices. And so the centralized kitchen was where all of the meals would essentially be prepared, packaged, and shipped to all the schools. The other component of this, it offered a possibility of opening this up to the community in that nutrition was working on potential partnerships with that type of a centralized kitchen. Local agricultural farmers were interested in partnering to expand that into production for them as well, especially during the summer months when our school activities slow down. Revenue source.
And without that, the kitchens in the 4 high schools would be doing that, all 4 high schools
Yes.
would be doing that
What they do
work?
is they prepare the meals for each quadrant, and that would actually be like it is now in the high schools.
Okay. Thank you.
So on the phone, we have Paul Hanley, who has graciously offered to step up because Chris had some kind of emergency come up and was unable to call in to help walk us through this.
Hi, Paul.
Hello.
All right,
So
Paul.
is the presentation on the screen?
We're getting it there.
Not yet.
Okay.
It is on the screen
Okay.
now.
Yeah.
Okay. So just to kick things off again, we did a random stratified sample. I say we, Chris Keating with Keating Research did a random stratified sample of 400 voters in an attempt to exactly match the demographics of those who will likely show up for November 2019. And unlike the last survey, it strictly focused on a 4 high school option. So there was no 2 high school option tested. And in this case, the way that they tested the 2 different options falling under the 4 high school option was to split the sample. So if you remember last time, the way they did it, they asked one of the questions, and then after they heard that question, then they asked another question in terms of, half heard 4 high schools, half heard 2 high schools, et cetera. So this time, half the sample only heard the larger proposal, and then half the sample only heard the smaller proposal. So we call that a split sample. And so as far as, one of the first questions that Chris's team typically asks is, generally speaking, would you say that Pueblo is headed in the right direction or in the wrong direction? And the good news is that there was an uptick in terms of folks saying right direction. So he did polling in April 2018 that indicated 44% right direction. That bumped up to 54% right direction for July 2019. If you go to page 3, again, what Mr. Horner described, that first option, the larger one, $256 million par amount, was tested. And the results on page 4 show that we're at 54% yes versus 42% no. The good news is that the what I call the intensity was higher for the definitely yes versus the definitely no. Although the definitely no intensity at 29% is still worrisome. Just so you know, when we look at these, some pollsters would like to see high 50s in terms of support level to feel comfortable that based on the current form of the question that you have a chance at the ballot. We typically, when we do polling, we typically say 56 to 58%, we being George K. Bauman Company. That's what I look for. And the reality is that it's rare that the percentages ever go up. They usually go down because voters look for a reason to vote no from now until Election Day. So then the other question, again, half the sample heard $218 million par amount. And the results of that on page 6 show that we're at 56% support with intensity of 31% definitely yes versus 24% definitely no. So a little bit better. And then on page 7, similar to what Chris did last time, he tested additional information to see if voters would be more likely to vote yes based on that information. And so these are ranked order and based of percentage more likely to vote yes. And so most important to the voters was accountability, knowing that all spending would be publicly disclosed. They're at 76% more likely to support it, which is pretty common. It doesn't matter which district we work with, that's pretty common that voters are more likely to support it when they hear that message. Second, it'll improve access to career and technical education programs, 72%. Chris also included in this lineup items that were tested from the June poll, just so you had a sense of what resonated with voters. So he tested up-to-date safety and security systems, had traction with voters. Also modernized classrooms, 69%. Again, in the June poll, he tested repairing 9 different elementary and middle schools. That was at 69% more likely. And we kind of go down the list from there. On page 8, he pulled out a few items that I don't think they were clunkers in terms of the percentage, but they just didn't resonate as well as the other messages or the other parts of the package. And so he tested properly sized high schools for Centennial and East High Schools at knowing that 59%. In this case, he for the sample that was the larger proposal, he actually mentioned the 1,100 students. And then he had a similar question or a similar item that he tested with the smaller package where it's 1,000 students, and they're both at 59%. And then lastly, he tested it will build and equip 2 new replacement schools for Centennial and East High School. It's kind of a general statement, and that was at 45%. So then another important question is, not just do you support it, but would you be willing to pay for it? And here's the tax impact. So rather than getting into the details of whatever Mr. Horner just described at the, $6.62 or whatever it was, they rounded up to $7 for the smaller package and $8 for the larger package. So we tested both the monthly impact in that question as well as the annual impact out of respect for the taxpayer. So not just that monthly amount. And so it turns out that based on that in both cases, 59% of those polled were willing to pay that amount in support of the measure. Then on page 10, he tested various messages in support, again, to see if it resonated with voters. And the 2 messages that resonated most with voters, one was most Pueblo schools are more than 50 years old and many are in poor condition. This ballot question will replace 2 out-of-date high schools and complete essential repairs and improvements to nearly half of Pueblo schools. And that was 41% very convincing. And then the other message that resonated, a quality education for Pueblo students depends on having access to a quality school. He then talked about modernizing classrooms, expanding access to technology, increasing career and tech education, and closing with a better place to learn will improve education outcomes and prepare the next generation for success. That was at 42% with 71% total convincing. So then lastly, what he didn't do last time was to what we call a informed ballot. So he did the first question last time, but never had a follow-up question. So what they did here was indicate, now that you've heard more about about the proposal, would you support it? And so we see that on the left-hand side, you see the $256 million proposal. Again, that's the par amount, which they would see in the ballot question. And it went from 54% support to 57% support. But just as important is that the no votes went down. So we went from 42% no to 37% no. And then with the $218 million option, the half that heard that, it was at 56% and then ticked up to 57%. But again, more importantly, that no vote went from 37 to 33%. So if you remember from the last poll, we tested that 2 high school option, and it was only at 31% yes, and that's where you said, okay, that's a non-starter. Let's start looking at the 4 high school option. And if we go back to that old survey, we were testing the largest amount tested yet, and it was at 54% support. However, it was only 24% definitely yes. So what we're seeing here is better results, well, not dramatically higher, but higher. But what I like is that the definitely yes vote is creeping up, which is really important. That as Chris mentioned last time, the definitely yes and definitely no kind of hold their position, but those probably yes voters sometimes will shift to a no vote. So we're always careful about looking at the results to make sure there wasn't too big of a percentage of probably yes voters. So with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions you have.
I don't, it doesn't sound like we have any right now, but you've done a great job.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks for your time.
Okay. At this point, I think we need to be really clear that we are not looking at ballot language at this point, but we are. I think today that we need to talk about these 3 options and hopefully develop some consensus on how to proceed. We've got this information. Do we have questions about the differences between the 3 options? So just to be clear, each of these options include a new school at Centennial, a new school at East, and of course, the cost of demolition. Upgrades at Central, Minnequaw, Heaton, Belmont, Franklin, South, Pueblo Academy of Arts, Beulah Heights, Highland Park, South Park, and Sunset Park. They include, in every case, closing 3 schools, Bradford, Carlisle, and Roncalli, as a consolidation as the other schools are upgraded. And the new construction, then option A includes the centralized kitchen and the aquatic center. Option B includes just the centralized kitchen, and option C includes none of those. And each of them, of course, has some allocation for the charter schools. So does that make sense to everybody? So tonight, as we have worked through this process and worked hard to gather as much information as we can, I think that we as a board ought to make some decisions about which of these options we'd like to move forward with, and then talk about what information needs to be included in ballot language. We are not writing ballot language or certifying ballot language. I want to be real clear about that. But we did meet a little earlier with one of the community groups who had some ideas about what information needed to be included in ballot language in order to balance the trust issues that we've talked about and the need. I believe our board has been very clear that we are committed to a 4 high school option. And so we'd like to certainly invite in the next couple days information from any community member who has ideas about not ballot language, but things that should be included in the ballot language, like perhaps an oversight committee. We're working hard to be responsive, and we want this bond offering to be a positive experience and have a positive outcome, as we know we've certainly talked for a long time about the need. So we have a consensus about moving forward. Do you have thoughts about these options and the information that we've had tonight?
Well, I'll take a shot at it. Obviously, I appreciate the work that Mr. Horner and Mr. Lawson did in terms of coming up with, I know this had to be very difficult to get to these numbers. I've maintained from the very beginning that, there was room to discuss what the cost should be, that was a fair item for discussion. And I think this work that you folks done has borne that out. I've also said that there's no question in my mind, but that we have, the one thing we can debate is whether or not we have significant structural needs in our schools. And I think that's obvious. And,
Yeah.
and it continues to be brought forth in the information that we got, even with the updated information we have now. I am also interested in hearing, we had some community members that indicated that they were supportive, but they wanted to make sure that they were hearing us correctly, and I'll just speak for myself at this point in time, that we at our last meeting said we were going to do 4 schools. That's what we intend to do. Throughout the stakeholder process, we gave out a whole lot of information about what work would be done at those schools that were obviously the 2 new schools, that they're going to be new schools if we go forward with this, but that the other schools would receive the priority 1 and or priority 2 fixes that they needed. We told you that that's what we would do, and I, in my own mind, convinced that's exactly what we're going to do. There was some question about whether or not there should be an accountability committee. We discussed that during the stakeholder process, and I think everybody was on board and still is on board that there should be a community accountability committee to make sure that the money's being spent in the manner that we told you we were going to spend it. And would highly recommend that if we go forward with any kind of language, that obviously be in there, and that hopefully we're going to be successful in this bond venture. And one of the first things we'll do if we are successful is gather that accountability committee from day one to make sure that we're keeping our word on what we're going to do. I see no reason why we would deviate from what we've said we're going to do, and it's pretty much out there in writing now. I think it should be understood that at some point during this construction, there may be something that has to be modified a little bit, but any modifications would still go to the major purpose that we said that money was going to go to. So I'm confident that the Oversight Committee will be a tremendous asset if we decide that we're going to go through with a bond issue. Mr. Bump, the question has arisen, and I'm going to do this the way lawyers do it. If there was a suggestion that we propose bond language, and if we were successful in passing a bond issue, what concerns should we have? We have 3 board positions that are opening. So there's going to be some change in the board already. Mr. Latino's indicated that he's not planning on running again. What concerns should I have, and should this community have, that a new board, whatever that makeup would be, would come in here and say, yeah, that's what you said in the ballot, but here's what we think should be done with this money now? What is a new board pretty much going to be bound by what we have out there for the public to consider and vote on?
Yes, as you indicated, the ballot question would be pretty specific, and any expenditures of proceeds that were approved by the voters under the language of the ballot question would have to be consistent with that or within the scope of the ballot question, regardless of who's on the board.
So the answer is yes.
Yes.
Thank you.
Good point. Thank you very much. Yes, the ballot, there's a legal obligation for whatever the makeup of the board is, to follow the whatever the ballot question lists or says.
In looking at options B and C, and from the results that we just heard, I think that it would behoove us to approach this in a way that we have the strongest support of whatever option we decide between B and C, and relaying that to the community. My concern is, and I've said this consistently, the inside-out approach. I would like to know if everyone in this district, or 90% of the people in this district, are going to support us as we move forward. I think that's critical. I think it's paramount. Also, I think that the idea of a centralized kitchen, to me, I don't think it's necessary personally, because I think based on the experience that I've had and continue to hear, is that our 4 high school kitchens do an outstanding job in providing food in a consistent manner for the quadrants in which they serve. So I don't think that is a selling point to the electorate. Also, a concern that I have is the beautification of our current grounds. I remember when we were approaching the bond in, I believe it was 2002, when we had site-based shared decision-making, which made it a whole lot easier because the sites determined what their priorities were moving forward. But the voices that were heard loud and clear then and must be heard loud and clear now are the voices of the students. The student voices will have much greater impact on the voters than any adult voices, in my opinion. So we need to make sure, as we move together in a plan of action, that their voices are there and that they know and understand what we're pursuing. The big question prior was the 4 high schools. Now we've decided the 4 high schools are the way we're headed. And I would just like to know, are each quadrant, are they in support of what we're going to do moving forward? And if they are, what are their ideas? As President Clementi mentioned earlier, we need to hear from not only one specific community. We've heard a lot from the East High School community. We've heard that loud and clear. Now we need to hear from the Central community, from the South community, and from the Centennial community, and what their wishes are moving forward with regard to this matter. And then we need to have everybody working together on this plan of action from the inside-out approach. We need to be speaking the same language moving forward with regard to this convincing the general public to pass a bond so that we can upgrade our schools. I remember Board Member Flores, who is now City Council President when I was principal at Centennial, and we were going for a bond. He said one of the concerns that he had heard loud and clear was the way our grounds appear now. And if you take a ride in the District 60 corridor, I don't know that street appeal is there, personally. I see many playgrounds that are weeds, and I don't think there's a campus that's exempt from that. And I think that as the voters look at that, they're going to say, wait a minute, what are we doing to maintain what we have, and what assurances moving forward are we going to receive? And I think that was one of the accountability factors that came out with regard to the survey. So we have a lot of work to do, and I know, Mr. Lane, I'm glad you're here. I appreciate you being here, and I apologize for not getting back to you, but we have a lot of discussions that concern this matter. But you sent me a proposal right around the $218 million range, and you know, something with regard to that, and I know I can't ask you the question right now, but through our superintendent and whatever direction we go with regard to the oversight committee, we need to get the right players on this oversight committee. We need to get people that are going to, with the game plan, that are going to go out to each quadrant, and we're going to speak the same language. And if it's 1,000 student high school with a gym or without a gym, with an auditorium, without an auditorium, we have to make sure that people are convinced that we're trying to do the right things in the best interest of all the schools within this district, priorities 1, 2, and 3. So those are things that I think as we move forward with the proper game plan that we need to have with regard to pursuing and convincing the electorate that this is essential, and this district's at the crossroads, and we need to move forward. This community's at the crossroads as well.
Are you proposing that we look further at option C?
I think we need to look at the option that presents us the best chance of passing it, and to my, from what I've been hearing and with the data that we have here, it's clearly evident that the more intensity that we can get from voters supporting this, if it's a lower option, but I don't think that the kitchen is an issue. I think there's other things that the general public's concerned about rather than if we have a centralized kitchen. So if that's the difference between B and C, I really don't see a big difference there. But I think we need to do something with regard to the landscape of our schools moving forward. So when whomever's touring this community, you know, be it businesses that are thinking of relocating, they can go to any campus and say, you know what, that's well maintained. Now, I know the inside, there's no question about it. But the outside, I think we need to improve upon the curb appeal with our schools moving forward. So yes, to answer your question, I think the bond that gives us the most the leverage moving forward would be something that I would support.
It's my understanding as I look through these, as we've pared down option B and C, we're looking only at safety and security priorities, 1, and some maybe 2, but that grounds improvement aren't really on we're not able to do that under either of the new options.
No, there's nothing in here about the grounds improvements. And I think as Mr. Latino has mentioned, the biggest challenge we have right now is just manpower. 3 people on the north side of town and 3 on the south, they just can't keep up.
Well, and I think that's important because once again, if we're going to say this is what we're going to spend the money on, we can't then say, oh, by the way, we've decided we're going to put some money aside for this too. It's not included here. One of the other things, President Clemente, I'd like to point out is when you go down these options, and by the way, I'll just tell you right now, based on what I hear in the community and everything, I'm on my suggestion would be is if we move forward with anything, that it would be option C. And if we're unable to convince the public of option C, then we have some very considerable issues going forward. But keep in mind also that it's not just the centralized kitchen. There are a number of other big item things here. Replace exterior windows at Sunset Park. That's $1 million savings there. I mean, and then $1 million replace exterior windows, Highland Park. Replace exterior windows at South Park Elementary School. That's another $1 million. So it's not just that. There are some other big ticket items here that are being cut out of this thing in order to get from the $278 million down to the $237 million. And it's not just the $4.7 million from the kitchen. And I'm like Mr. Latino. I in the list of priorities, I think that rates pretty low. So if you were asking that we were to present any language someplace along the line, I would be in favor of option C going forward.
Thank you.
I also, just looking at all this, and I totally agree with both of them. My concern is, will Pueblo grow? And I brought that up last time. I see City Council and the powers that be up working on expanding our convention center. And there has to be a plan for why we're doing that. And with our housing market now booming for purchase, I think we're ranked 10th in the country right now. I think I read that. We still have capacity at South and Central to grow. So I support the option C. We still have that capacity. It's not like when we fill these schools up, they're closed, they're capped. But we do have we still have that option of
Good point.
growth. So I would support the option C. I think it's more reasonable for our community. And I appreciate the work Superintendent Macaluso has done with her group to bring that number down from 311. You did a nice job, very nice job. Appreciate that work. Thank you.
Mr. Voss.
So I guess the question I would have on option C is, are we sacrificing too much? Because something I heard from the community a lot is they want to see significant improvements, not Band-Aid solutions. So do you think that 218 number will be significant enough?
Well, from a facilities position, no. There's $300 million in priority 1 and priority 2 repairs needed across the district, but there's no realistic way of doing that. This is a good approach. It's a step. It's definitely moving in the right direction. Doing nothing or something else, along the lines of not having a bond is going to be much more of a challenge. So this is definitely a step in the right direction to address some of it.
Okay. And that's what I come back to, is it's something that's absolutely critical that I believe we're in desperate need of, bond money. So I'd say I support option C as well.
Great, thank you. It sounds to me that we have some consensus with option C. And I believe, Mrs. Macaluso, that we'd like to look at possible bond language around option C. If we get information from community members that, about points or parts of a bond offering that they'd like to have included, I think that can certainly inform the language as we build it. Sound right? I do want to be clear that option C doesn't include those exterior windows, as you mentioned, nor does it and it includes 2 new high schools whose capacity would be 1,000 students. What are we considering in terms of that extra, the auxiliary gym or the auditorium? I just am not clear about that with the new builds.
I believe the architect put $4 million into each project to cover that, along with the, because 1,000 capacity, if you remember from the stakeholder meetings, was all that we actually needed in capacity, but the stakeholders very much wanted that other auxiliary gym or auditorium, and so that's why we went to the 1,200, because that had that.
Right.
And so that's why we pared down in 2 steps to try to see where do we get to a dollar amount that also works on the taxpayer.
So the difference between a 1,200 student capacity high school and an 1,100 or a 1,100 and 1,000 would be 4 classrooms, or is that oversimplified?
Primarily, 4 classrooms would be 100 students, give or take, and then you might have a little less in some of your core area because it wouldn't need to be quite as big. But, a gymnasium floor is still a gymnasium floor. And
They do have
things,
to be a
so-
certain size.
Right. And any of these, we will definitely design, where are we going to add the next set of classrooms, pre-plan and
Great.
try to stub out the conduits and things so that we're prepped if we need to. Where would you add if you put in a second gym, where would you put an auditorium so that it's conceptual, ready to go in the
Great.
future?
All right.
Any more to add?
I believe, Mrs. Macaluso, that I have consensus here of the board, that we'd like to move forward and look at this option C as a real possible bond offering.
I'd also like to add, Superintendent Macaluso, and I understand, Mr. Lawson, we do not have the manpower, but I have faith in our youth. I always have. And I would like to see, moving forward, if we are successful, I'd like to see each school come up with a campus beautification plan, and where they will take ownership with the Booster Club and with the alumni associations. The high schools have your alumni associations and the Booster Clubs, but every school, elementary and middle, do have some building leadership committees that made up of the stakeholders, that I think if we put together a priority plan, that we can see a change in the beautification with regard to the facilities. And I know students, they're at the high school level, you have Key Club, they have a community service component, and you have various clubs and organizations, even in this community, that would help with that. Board Member Mays with his Adopt a School program, that can also be part of it in terms of a school community beautification, because we really do have to do something with the curb appeal of our schools. And that would include Dutch Clark Stadium with regard to somehow, some way, coming up with some funding to pave that parking lot, and also at the various high schools, somehow, some way, if that can be done. So as a consideration moving forward.
Thank you.
President Clementi, just a couple other things, please, if I
Yes.
may. One is, I've had some discussions with Mr. Lawson, and I think it'd be good for the community to hear at this point in time. Mr. Lawson, when we're talking about building schools, what are we talking? What's the standard for the industry in terms of dollars per square foot? And do you have buildings that you can specifically, new school buildings that were recent, that could give you an idea of how much
Yes,
is out there? Because when it comes down to it, that's what this thing is all about, is what the price of the buildings are going to cost. So could you give us a little bit of history?
Sure, a
on that?
couple recent comparables. The new Swallows Charter Academy, that there's been, they were the recipients of the BEST grant to do that. It's been in the news quite a bit. That building is being constructed at $368 a square foot. Denver High School constructed a school here recently, I think it was over the last couple of years. That was around $348 a square foot. Canyon City did some demolition and work at their middle school, and that was, I believe, around $310, $315 a square foot. So that's kind of the average of what you're seeing out there, is 300 plus a square foot. It's just what the market is right now.
Does location have anything to do with cost as well? I mean, is it a different standard for Denver than it might be for Pueblo?
It's cheaper up there. There's a lot more contractors. It's highly competitive. You know, we're limited on the number of services provided in the southern Colorado region. I know they do a great job here locally, but Denver is just super competitive because of the number of them up there.
Thank you, sir. And finally, if I may, I'd like to introduce Mitchell Morrow. Mitchell is a sophomore at Central. And the reason I'm introducing Mitchell is when we were going through the process of having the discussion, he sent me an email to my school email and said, I want to talk to you about all this stuff with the school options and all that. I was a fairly decent cross-examiner when I was a defense attorney. I don't know if I was as good as Mitchell, though, because he kept me there for about an hour and a half, 2 hours, and had a great number of questions. He had his computer there. He had all of the information, and we had a great discussion. And I just want to acknowledge that here he is today in the middle of the summer vacation, that he would be here today to hear some more information. And I think it speaks to what Mr. Latino was talking about the type of student that we have here in Pueblo. So, Mitchell, thank you for being here today.
Yes, thank you and welcome. All right, then I believe that we've given you more work to do. And we can move on. Our 11.0 consent agenda includes items 2, 3, and 4. I will move acceptance of the consent agenda as presented.
Second.
Call for the vote, please.
Ms. Clementi?
Aye.
Mr. Gonzalez?
Aye.
Mr. Latino?
Aye.
Mr. Mays?
Aye.
Mr. Voss?
Aye.
Great. Then we have 2 action items, which the first are leadership appointments that I'll defer to you, Mrs. Macaluso.
Thank you, President Clementi. At this time, I would ask the Board of Education to consider the following leadership appointments. The first one would be for Ms. Tracy Spinuzzi, Assistant Principal, Pueblo Academy of Arts, to Assistant Principal, Centennial High School, effective August 1st, 2019. The next appointment would be for Mr. Michael Trevenak, Assistant Principal, Roncalli STEM Academy, to Principal, Roncalli STEM Academy, effective August 1st, 2019.
I move that we accept the superintendent's administrative leadership appointments.
Second.
Call for the vote, please.
Ms. Clementi?
Aye.
Mr. Gonzalez?
Aye.
Mr. Latino?
Aye.
Mr. Mays?
Aye.
Mr. Voss?
Aye.
Thank you. Secondly, we have the findings, conclusions, and recommendations of an arbitrator in the matter of an arbitration between Pueblo City Schools and the Association of Custodial Maintenance Employees. It was a grievance, number 1803. And I will move that we accept the recommendations of the arbitrator in this matter.
Second.
Call for the vote, please.
Ms. Clementi?
Aye.
Mr. Gonzalez?
Aye.
Mr. Latino?
Aye.
Mr. Mays?
Aye.
Mr. Voss?
Aye.
Thank you. Before we close, I would like to recommend that each of you take the time to attend the summer musical. Hello Dolly is being presented, it's the 61st annual presentation of musical theater here in Pueblo. It was there on opening day on Saturday. It will be presented again tonight, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, at 7 o'clock at the Arts Center. It's some of the best entertainment you will see, period.
Ms. Maury and I will attend this evening, so we're excited.
Great. Have my little pin on. Anything else for the good of the cause tonight? Nope. Then we are adjourned at 4:54. Thank you very much.